Please, sir, can you read this letter? It's very, very important. The trembling voice of a 7-year-old little girl echoed through the imposing silence of the corporate lobby, her small hands clutching a wrinkled envelope as if it were her most precious treasure. Behind the little girl's crystal blue eyes there was a determination that defied her young age. She had crossed the city alone, faced the public transportation system, and arrived there guided only by a dying mother's desperate hope. Dorothy wasn't just fragile. She was brave beyond her years. Kevin Barton, a 33-year-old millionaire CEO, reigned over his technological empire with an iron fist and an armored heart. Known for his coldness in business and emotional detachment, he had built walls so high around his personal life that even he could no longer scale them. But something about this urgent letter from a child intrigued him. When Kevin met the little girl who had interrupted his day, the world stopped. Dorothy's blue eyes were a perfect mirror of his own. The shape of her face, the way she tilted her head when thinking. Every detail screamed an impossible truth that he had believed himself sterile for years. The receptionist held her breath. Security guards exchanged confused glances. Even the executives passing by slowed their pace, sensing that something extraordinary was happening in that ordinary lobby. Susan Osborne, Kevin's girlfriend, watched from the elevator entrance, her face paling as she noticed the undeniable resemblance between the man she loved and the unknown child. This isn't just a story about lost and found love. It's about the courage of a child who decided to fight for her family, about second chances that arrive disguised as wrinkled letters, and about how sometimes the most important things in life come in the smallest packages. Kevin Barton was about to discover that his entire life had been built on lies, but was Nancy Cromwell really telling the truth about Dorothy? And what would Susan do to protect the relationship she had spent years building? Some letters change destinies, and this one was about to rewrite 3 lives forever. The morning mist clung to the towering glass facade of Barton Tech Industries like a shroud, casting ethereal shadows across the bustling streets of downtown Seattle. 7-year-old Dorothy Cromwell stood at the base of the 40-story building, her small fingers clutching a wrinkled envelope against her chest. Her golden hair caught the filtered sunlight streaming through the clouds, and her piercing blue eyes reflected a determination that seemed far too mature for her young face. The lobby of Barton Tech buzzed with the controlled chaos of corporate life. Men and women in expensive suits hurried past marble pillars, their heels clicking against the polished floors like a symphony of ambition. Dorothy approached the imposing reception desk, where a woman with perfectly styled auburn hair and a crisp navy blazer sat behind a computer screen. "Excuse me, ma'am," Dorothy said, her voice barely above a whisper as she stood on her tiptoes to see over the desk. The receptionist, Margaret Harrison, looked down with surprise at the unexpected visitor. "Well, hello there, sweetheart," Margaret said, her professional demeanor softening instantly. "Are you lost? Where are your parents?" Dorothy shook her head vigorously, her blonde curls bouncing. "I'm not lost. I need to give this letter to the most important man in this building. Mommy said it's very, very important." She held up the envelope with both hands, as if it were made of precious glass. Margaret glanced around the lobby, uncertain how to handle this unusual situation. "What's your name, honey?" "Dorothy Cromwell. And this letter is for the boss man. Mommy wrote it and she said I had to make sure he reads it today because—" Dorothy's voice wavered slightly. "Because she might not be able to write any more letters soon." The innocence in Dorothy's voice, coupled with the gravity of her words, sent a chill down Margaret's spine. She looked at the envelope, noticing the careful handwriting that spelled out Kevin Barton, CEO, urgent and personal, in elegant script. "Sweetie, Mr. Barton is a very busy man. He's in meetings all day and—" "Please," Dorothy interrupted, her blue eyes filling with tears that she refused to let fall. "Mommy said this is the most important letter she's ever written. She said it might save both of us." Margaret felt her heart constrict. Something about this little girl's desperation resonated with her maternal instincts. Against all company protocol, she picked up her phone and dialed Kevin Barton's direct line. 40 floors above, Kevin Barton sat in his corner office, a monument to success and isolation. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Elliott Bay, But Kevin rarely noticed the beauty beyond the glass. His dark hair was impeccably styled, his charcoal gray suit pressed to perfection, and his steel blue eyes focused intently on quarterly reports spread across his mahogany desk. At 33, Kevin had built Barton Tech from a small software startup into one of Seattle's most successful technology companies. But success had come at a cost. His office felt more like a fortress than a workplace, designed to keep the world at a safe distance. The walls were lined with awards and accolades, but conspicuously absent of any personal photographs or mementos that might hint at a life beyond corporate achievement. His phone buzzed, interrupting his concentration. "Mr. Barton," Margaret's voice came through the intercom. "I have an unusual situation down here. There's a little girl who insists on delivering a letter to you personally. She says it's urgent." Kevin's jaw tightened with irritation. "Margaret, you know I don't have time for—" "Sir, with all due respect, I think you should see this child. There's something different about this situation. The letter is marked personal and urgent, and she seems genuinely distressed." Kevin closed his eyes and rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar tension headache beginning to form. His day was already packed with back-to-back meetings, and he had no patience for interruptions, especially ones involving children. But Margaret had been with the company for 8 years and had never made such a request before. "Fine," he said curtly. "Send her up, but make it quick." As Margaret escorted Dorothy to the executive elevator, the little girl's eyes widened with wonder at the opulent lobby. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow patterns on the walls, and abstract artwork worth more than most people's annual salaries adorned every corner. But Dorothy wasn't intimidated by the grandeur. She was focused solely on her mission. The elevator ride to the 40th floor felt like an eternity. Dorothy pressed her face against the glass wall of the elevator, watching Seattle shrink below her. "It's like being in the clouds," she whispered to Margaret, who smiled despite her nervousness about breaking protocol. When the elevator doors opened with a soft chime, Dorothy found herself in an executive suite that looked more like a luxury hotel than an office space. Thick Persian rugs covered polished hardwood floors, and original oil paintings hung between mahogany-paneled walls. Margaret led her down a corridor lined with conference rooms, each equipped with the latest technology. "Mr. Barton's office is just through those doors," Margaret said gently, pointing to a set of imposing double doors at the end of the hallway. "Remember, he's very busy, so try to be brief, okay?" Dorothy nodded solemnly and walked toward the doors with the measured steps of someone carrying the weight of the world on their small shoulders. She raised her tiny fist and knocked 3 times, the sound echoing in the quiet corridor. "Come in," came a deep, authoritative voice from within. Dorothy pushed open the heavy door and stepped into Kevin Barton's domain. The office was even more impressive than the rest of the suite, with a massive desk positioned strategically in front of windows that offered a commanding view of the Seattle skyline. Behind the desk sat a man who looked like he had stepped out of a business magazine cover. Kevin looked up from his computer screen, prepared to deal with yet another interruption to his carefully scheduled day. But when his eyes fell on Dorothy, something unexpected happened. The irritated expression on his face froze, replaced by something that looked almost like recognition, though he couldn't understand why. The little girl standing in his doorway had the most startling blue eyes he had ever seen, eyes that seemed to mirror his own with uncanny precision. Her golden hair caught the light from his desk lamp, and there was something about the shape of her face, the determined set of her small jaw, that seemed hauntingly familiar. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Kevin found himself studying Dorothy's features with an intensity that surprised him, while Dorothy stood frozen in the doorway, suddenly aware of the gravity of the moment her mother had prepared her for. "Are you the boss man?" Dorothy finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper in the vast office. Kevin cleared his throat, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had overcome him. "I'm Kevin Barton, the CEO of this company. You must be the little girl with the letter." Dorothy nodded and walked across the plush carpet toward his desk, her small sneakers silent on the thick fibers. She held out the envelope with both hands, as if presenting a sacred offering. "Mommy wrote this for you. She said it's very, very important and that you have to read it right now." Dorothy's eyes never left his face as she spoke, searching for something she couldn't name. Kevin took the envelope, noting how the paper felt slightly damp from Dorothy's nervous perspiration. The handwriting on the front was elegant but shaky, as if written by someone fighting against physical weakness. Something about that handwriting tugged at a memory buried deep in his mind, but he couldn't quite place it. He opened the envelope carefully, aware that Dorothy was watching his every movement with intense concentration. As he unfolded the letter, a faint scent of lavender wafted up from the paper, a fragrance that sent an unexpected jolt of recognition through his system. The letter was written on simple stationery, but the words it contained would shatter Kevin's carefully constructed world. My dearest Kevin, I know this letter will come as a shock to you, and I pray you will find it in your heart to read it completely before making any judgments. My name is Nancy Cromwell, though you knew me once as Nancy Peterson. 8 years ago, we shared something beautiful together, something that created the most precious gift I have ever received. Our daughter, Dorothy. Kevin's hands began to tremble as he read, his breath catching in his throat. Nancy Peterson. The name hit him like a physical blow, bringing with it a flood of memories he had spent years trying to suppress. Nancy, with her radiant smile and gentle touch. Nancy, who had left him broken and believing in nothing but his own isolation. Nancy, whom he had loved more than life itself. I know what you must be thinking, the letter continued, and I know the circumstances under which we parted were painful and confusing. But Kevin, our daughter needs you now, and I have nowhere else to turn. I am dying. The doctors give me perhaps 2 months, maybe less. I have exhausted all my savings on treatments that have only delayed the inevitable. Dorothy doesn't know how sick I am, but she knows that something is terribly wrong. Kevin's vision blurred as he read, his successful businessman's facade cracking with each word. He glanced up at Dorothy, who was still watching him with those impossibly familiar blue eyes, and felt his world shifting on its axis. Dorothy is everything good about both of us. She has your intelligence, your determination, and your beautiful eyes. She has been my strength through this illness, caring for me with a maturity that breaks my heart. She deserves so much more than I can give her now. She deserves a father who can provide for her, protect her, and love her the way every child should be loved. Kevin's chest felt tight, as if he couldn't draw enough air into his lungs. The little girl standing before him, this child who had seemed so familiar, was claiming to be his daughter, but that was impossible. He was sterile. The doctors had told him years ago that he would never be able to have children, a fact that had driven a wedge between him and every relationship he had ever attempted. I know you believed you could never have children. Nancy's letter seemed to read his thoughts. But the doctors were wrong, Kevin. Dorothy is living proof of that. She is 7 years old, born 9 months after that last beautiful night we spent together before everything fell apart. I never told you about the pregnancy because by then, you believed I had betrayed you and I was too proud and too hurt to fight for us anymore. Kevin's mind raced back to that terrible time 8 years ago. He remembered the photos that Susan had shown him, pictures that appeared to show Nancy with another man. He remembered the anonymous phone calls telling him that Nancy was cheating, the witnesses who claimed to have seen her in compromising situations. The evidence had seemed overwhelming, and his trust, once broken, had never fully healed. I don't expect you to believe me immediately, the letter continued, but I beg you to look at Dorothy and see the truth for yourself. More importantly, I beg you to get to know her. She is the most wonderful person I have ever known, and if something happens to me, she will have no one. Her grandparents are gone, and I have no siblings. You are her only hope for a future filled with love and security. The letter concluded with Nancy's address and a phone number, along with a desperate plea for Kevin to visit them, if not for her sake, then for Dorothy's. The signature at the bottom was barely legible, as if Nancy had used the last of her strength to finish this final communication. Kevin set the letter down with trembling hands and looked up at Dorothy, seeing her with entirely new eyes. The shape of her nose, the way she tilted her head when she was thinking, the stubborn set of her jaw. It was like looking at a feminine version of his own childhood photographs. Dorothy, he said softly, his voice hoarse with emotion, How old are you, sweetheart? 7, Dorothy replied, holding up 7 small fingers. I'll be 8 in December. December 15th. Kevin's breath caught. December 15th was exactly 9 months after the last night he had spent with Nancy. The timeline matched perfectly, and the physical resemblance was undeniable. But more than that, there was something about Dorothy's presence that felt like coming home, as if a part of him he hadn't known was missing had suddenly been restored. Before he could respond, his office door burst open without a knock. Susan Osborne strode in, her high heels clicking aggressively against the hardwood floor. She was dressed in a fitted red dress that emphasized her curves, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun that accentuated her sharp cheekbones. At 29, Susan was undeniably beautiful, but there was a hardness in her brown eyes that became more pronounced when she was angry or threatened. Kevin, darling, we're supposed to be at lunch with the Richardson account in 10 minutes, and Margaret said. Susan stopped mid-sentence as her gaze fell on Dorothy. Her expression shifted from irritation to something much more dangerous, recognition and fear. Susan's eyes darted between Kevin and Dorothy, taking in the unmistakable resemblance between them. Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the way the color drained from her face as the implications hit her. For 8 years she had been Kevin's girlfriend, carefully positioning herself as the sophisticated, childless woman who understood his career ambitions and shared his lifestyle. She had worked tirelessly to erase any trace of Nancy Peterson from his life, building their relationship on the foundation of lies she had constructed. "Who is this child, Kevin?" Susan asked, her voice carefully controlled but with an underlying edge of panic. Kevin stood up slowly, the letter still clutched in his hand. "Susan, this is Dorothy. Dorothy, this is Miss Osborne." He couldn't bring himself to call Susan his girlfriend in front of the child who might be his daughter. Dorothy studied Susan with the frank curiosity of a child, unaware of the adult tensions swirling around her. "Are you the boss man's wife?" she asked innocently. Susan's laugh was sharp and forced. "Not yet, sweetheart, but hopefully someday." She moved closer to Kevin's desk, her eyes scanning the letter in his hands. "Kevin, what's going on here? Why is there a child in your office?" Kevin looked at Dorothy, then at Susan, feeling the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. "Dorothy brought me a letter from her mother. Her mother claims that Dorothy is my daughter." The words hung in the air like a live wire. Susan's composure cracked for just a moment, revealing the calculating panic beneath her polished exterior. She had spent years ensuring that Kevin would never discover the truth about Nancy, never learn about the child they had created together. And now, here was Dorothy, living proof of everything Susan had worked to hide. "Kevin, surely you don't believe—" Susan began, but Kevin held up his hand to silence her. "Dorothy," Kevin said, kneeling down to the child's eye level, "can you tell me about your mommy? Is she very sick?" Dorothy's lower lip trembled slightly, the first crack in the brave facade she had maintained all morning. "She gets really tired all the time, and sometimes she can't eat. She tries to hide it when she cries, but I hear her at night. The doctors keep giving her medicine, but it doesn't seem to help very much." Kevin felt his heart breaking at the child's words. Whether or not Dorothy was his biological daughter, she was clearly a little girl in crisis, dealing with adult problems that no child should have to face. "Where do you live, Dorothy? How did you get here today?" "We live in an apartment on Capitol Hill. Mommy gave me money for the bus, and she wrote down the directions for me. She said I'm a very smart girl, and that I could find you all by myself." Dorothy's pride in her accomplishment was evident, despite the circumstances that had brought her there. Kevin's mind reeled at the thought of a 7-year-old navigating the Seattle bus system alone, carrying what might be the most important letter of his life. The courage it must have taken for Dorothy to make that journey, and for Nancy to send her, spoke to a desperation that cut him to the core. "Kevin," Susan interjected, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion, "you can't possibly be considering that this child is yours. Remember what the doctors told you years ago. You can't have children." But Kevin was no longer listening to Susan. He was lost in Dorothy's eyes, seeing in them the echo of every dream he had abandoned when he believed he could never be a father. The child standing before him represented the possibility of everything he had convinced himself he didn't want, because it was impossible to have. "Dorothy," he said gently, "would you like to call your mommy and let her know you're safe? I think I'd like to meet her." Dorothy's face lit up with the first genuine smile Kevin had seen from her. "Really? Mommy said you might not want to see us. She said you're a very important man with lots of important things to do." "There's nothing more important than this," Kevin said, surprised by the conviction in his own voice. "Nothing at all." As Kevin reached for his phone to call Nancy, Susan grabbed his arm with desperate intensity. "Kevin, please, think about this rationally. You have a company to run, a life we've built together. You can't just throw everything away based on a letter from a woman who broke your heart 8 years ago." Kevin looked at Susan's perfectly manicured hand on his arm, then at Dorothy's small, trusting face. For the first time in years, the choice seemed crystal clear. "Susan, cancel my afternoon appointments. Dorothy and I are going to visit her mother." The drive to Capitol Hill was tense and silent. Kevin had insisted that Susan stay at the office despite her protests and demands to accompany them. He drove his black BMW through the Seattle traffic with unusual care, constantly glancing in his rearview mirror at Dorothy, who sat in the back seat with a borrowed child safety seat that Margaret had somehow produced from the company's emergency supplies. Dorothy directed him through the winding streets of Capitol Hill with surprising confidence, her small voice providing directions over the quiet hum of classical music from Kevin's radio. As they drove deeper into the residential neighborhood, Kevin noticed the gradual change from the polished business district to the more modest apartment buildings and small houses that characterize this part of the city. "Turn here," Dorothy said, as they approached a tree-lined street filled with older apartment complexes. "We live in the blue building with the white steps." Kevin parked in front of a modest 3-story building that had seen better days. The blue paint was faded and peeling in places, and the small front yard was more dirt than grass. It was a world away from Kevin's luxury penthouse, but there was something about the building's obvious attempts at maintenance: flower boxes in some windows, a carefully swept front walkway, that spoke to residents who cared about their home despite its limitations. Dorothy led him up 2 flights of narrow stairs, her small legs taking the steps with practiced ease. The hallway was dimly lit and smelled of cleaning products and cooking spices, a mixture of lives being lived in close proximity. They stopped in front of apartment 3B, and Dorothy pulled a small key from her pocket. "Mommy?" she called as she opened the door. "I brought someone to see you just like you asked." The apartment was tiny but meticulously clean, with sunlight streaming through windows that faced east toward downtown Seattle. The furniture was obviously secondhand but carefully arranged, and children's drawings were taped to the refrigerator and walls. It was clearly a home filled with love, even if it lacked material abundance. Nancy Cromwell emerged from what Kevin assumed was the bedroom, and the sight of her hit him like a physical blow. She had always been beautiful, but now she was ethereally fragile, her blonde hair thin and wispy from chemotherapy, her green eyes too large in her gaunt face. She wore a simple blue sweater and jeans that hung loosely on her diminished frame, but her smile when she saw Dorothy was radiant. "Dorothy, sweetheart, you made it back safely," Nancy said, kneeling down to embrace her daughter. Then her eyes met Kevin's over Dorothy's head, and the years seemed to collapse between them. "Hello, Kevin," Nancy said softly, her voice carrying the same melodic quality he remembered, but with an undertone of exhaustion that broke his heart. "Nancy," Kevin found that his voice was barely functional. Seeing her again, clearly ill and fighting for her life, brought back every emotion he had spent years suppressing. "I got your letter." Dorothy looked back and forth between the 2 adults, sensing the weight of their shared history even if she didn't understand it. "Mommy, is this my daddy?" she asked with the directness that only children possess. Nancy's eyes filled with tears as she looked at her daughter, then at Kevin. "Sweetheart, this is Kevin Barton. He's someone very special who knew Mommy a long time ago." Kevin knelt down beside Nancy and Dorothy, bringing himself to their eye level. Up close, the resemblance between himself and Dorothy was even more striking. They had the same eye color, the same shape of face, even the same small dimple in the left cheek that appeared when they smiled. "Dorothy," he said carefully, "your mommy and I need to talk about some grown-up things. Would you mind playing in your room for a little while?" Dorothy nodded solemnly and disappeared down the short hallway, but Kevin suspected she would be listening from behind her partially closed door. Children, he was learning, were much more perceptive than adults often gave them credit for. Nancy gestured for Kevin to sit on the small sofa, settling herself carefully in a chair across from him. Even that simple movement seemed to require effort, and Kevin found himself fighting the urge to help her, uncertain of the boundaries in this surreal situation. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Nancy said, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "When Dorothy told me she was going to find you and deliver the letter herself, I was terrified. But she was so determined, and I'm running out of options." Kevin studied Nancy's face, seeing past the illness to the woman he had once planned to marry. "Nancy, I need to know the truth. Is Dorothy really my daughter?" Nancy met his gaze steadily. "Kevin, I swear to you on everything I hold sacred, on Dorothy's life, she is your daughter. She was conceived the last night we were together, before everything fell apart between us. I found out I was pregnant 2 weeks after you. After we broke up. But the doctors told me I was sterile," Kevin said, confusion evident in his voice. "The tests, the diagnosis, medical tests can be wrong," Nancy replied. "Or maybe the situation changed. I don't know the medical explanation, Kevin. All I know is that Dorothy exists, and she's ours." Kevin was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. "Why didn't you tell me when you found out you were pregnant? Why let me believe all these years that I could never have children?" Nancy's composure finally cracked, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "Because you thought I had betrayed you. You wouldn't take my calls, wouldn't see me. Your secretary had instructions not to put me through. I tried, Kevin. I tried so hard to reach you, but you had already decided I was a liar and a cheat." The pain in Nancy's voice was raw and immediate, bringing back memories that Kevin had worked hard to bury. He remembered his own agony during that time, the way her supposed betrayal had shattered his ability to trust anyone completely. "The evidence seemed overwhelming," he said quietly. "The photos, the witnesses, the phone call." "What photos?" Nancy asked, confusion replacing pain in her expression. "What witnesses? Kevin, what are you talking about?" Before Kevin could respond, Dorothy appeared in the doorway, her young face creased with concern. "Mommy, why are you crying? Are you sicker?" Nancy quickly wiped her tears and smiled at her daughter. "No, sweetheart. These are happy tears. I'm crying because I'm happy that Mr. Kevin came to visit us." Dorothy studied both adults with the penetrating gaze that Kevin was beginning to recognize as one of her defining characteristics. "Are you my daddy?" she asked Kevin directly, her blue eyes searching his face for the truth. Kevin felt the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. This little girl deserved honesty, but he also needed certainty before he made any commitments that would change all their lives forever. "Dorothy," he said carefully, "I need to do some tests to make sure, but I promise you if I am your daddy, I will do everything I can to take care of both you and your mommy." Dorothy nodded as if this was a perfectly reasonable response. "Mommy says tests are important. She has lots of tests at the hospital." The mention of Nancy's medical situation brought Kevin back to the immediate crisis at hand. "Nancy, tell me about your condition. What exactly are the doctors saying?" Nancy glanced meaningfully at Dorothy, who was still hovering in the doorway. "Dorothy, sweetheart, would you go color in your coloring book while Mr. Kevin and I finish talking?" After Dorothy reluctantly disappeared again, Nancy's mask of strength finally slipped completely. "It's ovarian cancer, stage 4. It had already spread by the time they found it. I've been through 2 rounds of chemotherapy, but..." She trailed off, the unfinished sentence hanging heavy in the air. "What do the doctors say about treatment options?" Kevin asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. There's an experimental treatment at Seattle Cancer Care Alliance. It's shown promise in similar cases, but insurance won't cover it, and I can't afford it. The cost is astronomical. Over $200,000 just for the first phase. Nancy's voice was steady, but Kevin could see the desperation she was trying to hide. $200,000. For Kevin, it was less than he spent on his car. The realization of the different worlds they inhabited hit him with stunning clarity. While he lived in luxury, Nancy was literally dying from lack of funds for treatment. Nancy, regardless of the paternity test results, I want you to start that treatment immediately. I'll cover the costs. Nancy stared at him in shock. Kevin, you can't possibly. Yes, I can, he interrupted firmly. Dorothy needs her mother, and I. He paused, surprised by the emotion in his own voice. I can't bear the thought of losing you again. Not like this. From down the hallway came the sound of Dorothy's voice, talking to what Kevin assumed were her dolls or stuffed animals. My daddy came to visit today, she was saying. He's very tall and has blue eyes just like mine. I think he's going to help Mommy get better. The innocent certainty in Dorothy's voice cut through Kevin's heart like a blade. This child had already accepted him as her father, was already building dreams around his presence in their lives. The responsibility of that trust was both terrifying and exhilarating. I need to arrange for a DNA test, Kevin said quietly. Not because I don't believe you, but because I need legal documentation for Dorothy's sake. If she's my daughter, I want to make sure she's protected, that she has every right and benefit that should come with that. Nancy nodded, understanding the practical implications. Of course, whatever you need. In the meantime, I'm going to make some calls about your treatment. There's no reason to wait for test results to get you the medical care you need. As Kevin pulled out his phone to begin making arrangements, Nancy watched him with an expression of wonder and gratitude. Kevin, why are you doing this? After everything that happened between us, why are you willing to help? Kevin looked toward the hallway where Dorothy's voice could still be heard, now singing a soft lullaby to her toys. Because 8 years ago I lost the two most important things in my life, you and the family we could have had together. I may not understand what happened back then, but I'm not going to make the same mistake twice. That evening, Kevin returned to his penthouse overlooking Elliott Bay with his mind reeling from the day's revelations. The luxury of his home felt almost obscene after seeing Nancy and Dorothy's modest apartment. His living room, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and designer furniture, could have housed their entire apartment twice over. Susan was waiting for him, pacing the marble floors in an elegant black cocktail dress. She had obviously gone home to change and prepare for what she expected to be an important conversation about their future. Kevin, finally, she said, rushing to greet him. I've been worried sick. How did it go with that woman and her child? Kevin loosened his tie and walked to the bar cart in the corner of the room, pouring himself a generous glass of single malt scotch. Her name is Nancy, Susan. Nancy Cromwell. And her daughter's name is Dorothy. Fine, Nancy and Dorothy, Susan said impatiently. What did they want? Money? Some kind of settlement to go away? Kevin turned to face Susan, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time in their 2-year relationship. She was beautiful, sophisticated, and ambitious. Everything he had thought he wanted in a partner. But looking at her now, he realized how cold her beauty was, how calculating her every move. They didn't want anything except for me to know the truth, Kevin said. Nancy is dying, Susan. She has cancer, and she wanted me to know that Dorothy is my daughter. Susan's laugh was sharp and bitter. Kevin, please, you can't have children. We've discussed this countless times. It's one of the reasons our relationship works so well. Neither of us wants to be tied down by children. The medical diagnosis was wrong, Kevin said quietly. Or circumstances changed. I don't know the exact explanation, but Dorothy is my daughter. The resemblance alone is proof enough, but I've arranged for a DNA test to make it official. Susan's composure began to crack, revealing the desperation beneath her polished exterior. Kevin, you can't be serious. You have responsibilities here. The company needs you. I need you. We have plans for our future together. What kind of future, Susan? Kevin asked, genuinely curious. A future where I work 18-hour days and you attend charity events and plan vacations? A future where we congratulate ourselves on our success while my daughter grows up without a father? Your alleged daughter, Susan corrected sharply. Kevin, this woman abandoned you 8 years ago. She broke your heart, remember? Now she's dying and desperate, so she shows up with some child and claims it's yours? Can't you see what she's doing? Kevin studied Susan's face, noting the panic barely concealed beneath her anger. Something about her reaction seemed disproportionate to the situation. Susan, what exactly happened 8 years ago? I mean, what really happened? Susan's face went pale, but she recovered quickly. What do you mean? You know what happened. Nancy was cheating on you. There were photos, witnesses. You were devastated. I want to see those photos again, Kevin said. And I want the names of those witnesses. Kevin, that's ancient history. Why dredge up painful memories? Because I need to understand the truth. For Dorothy's sake and for my own. Kevin's voice carried a note of steel that Susan had rarely heard. I've made arrangements for Nancy to begin treatment at Seattle Cancer Care Alliance tomorrow. I've also arranged for Dorothy to stay with a nanny during the day while Nancy undergoes therapy. Susan stared at him as if he had lost his mind. You're paying for her treatment? Kevin, that will cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. For a woman who betrayed you and a child who probably isn't even yours. Even if Dorothy isn't my biological daughter, which I believe she is. She's an innocent child whose mother is dying. How could I live with myself if I had the power to help and chose not to? Susan's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the calculating woman beneath. Because it's not your responsibility. Because you have obligations to the people who have stood by you, who have built a life with you. Because throwing money at some woman's sob story isn't going to bring back whatever fantasy relationship you think you had with her 8 years ago. Kevin set down his scotch glass with deliberate care, the crystal ringing against the marble countertop. Susan, I think you should leave. Kevin, please don't let emotions cloud your judgment. We can work through this together. Maybe we could help the child in some other way, set up a trust fund or something, but you don't need to get personally involved. I said you should leave, Kevin repeated, his voice quiet but final. Susan stared at him for a long moment, seeming to realize that her usual tactics weren't working. Fine. But Kevin, when this fantasy implodes and you realize you've been manipulated, don't expect me to be waiting around to pick up the pieces. After Susan left, Kevin stood alone in his penthouse looking out at the lights of Seattle reflected in the dark waters of the bay. For the first time in years, his home felt empty, not because he was alone, but because the people who mattered weren't there with him. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for Dr. Michael Harrison, his personal physician and longtime friend. Mike, it's Kevin. I need a favor. I need a DNA test done as quickly and accurately as possible, and I need it done with complete discretion. Kevin, it's 11 o'clock at night. What's this about? Kevin walked to his window, looking out over the city where Nancy and Dorothy were probably sleeping in their small apartment. Mike, I think I might be a father. The next morning, Kevin arrived at Nancy and Dorothy's apartment with coffee, fresh pastries from a French bakery, and a car seat properly installed in his BMW. Nancy answered the door wearing the same clothes from the day before, but she had attempted to style her thinning hair and apply a small amount of makeup. Kevin, you didn't have to bring breakfast, Nancy protested, but gratefully accepted the coffee. Mommy, look, Dorothy exclaimed, running to the window. There's a really fancy car outside. It's so shiny. That's Mr. Kevin's car, sweetheart, Nancy explained. He's going to drive us to the hospital today. Dorothy's eyes widened with excitement. Really? Can I sit in the front seat? You'll sit in the back seat with a special car seat just like a race car driver, Kevin said, kneeling down to Dorothy's level. Safety first, right? As they drove to the Seattle Cancer Care Alliance, Kevin found himself studying Dorothy in the rearview mirror. She chattered continuously, pointing out interesting buildings, asking questions about how cars worked, and wondering aloud about whether the hospital would have good food in their cafeteria. Dorothy, you're quite the conversationalist, Kevin observed. What's a conversationist? Dorothy asked, struggling with the big word. It means you're really good at talking and asking interesting questions, Kevin explained, smiling at her in the mirror. Mommy says I ask too many questions sometimes, Dorothy replied thoughtfully. But she says curious people learn more about the world. Nancy reached back from the front seat to squeeze Dorothy's hand. That's right, sweetheart. Questions are how we discover new things. The Seattle Cancer Care Alliance was a modern facility nestled in the heart of the city's medical district. As they walked through the gleaming lobby, Dorothy stayed close to her mother's side, her usual chatter subdued by the clinical atmosphere. Kevin found himself fighting an unexpected surge of protectiveness as he watched Nancy navigate the check-in process with practiced efficiency. Mrs. Cromwell, the receptionist said warmly, Dr. Martinez is ready to see you. And I understand your treatment has been approved for immediate start? Nancy looked at Kevin with tears in her eyes. Yes, that's correct. While Nancy was whisked away for consultations and preparation, Kevin and Dorothy found themselves in the children's waiting area, a cheerfully decorated space with books, toys, and a small play kitchen. Are you scared for Mommy? Dorothy asked suddenly, settling beside Kevin on a child-sized couch that barely accommodated his tall frame. The directness of her question caught him off guard. Yes, I am a little scared. Are you? Dorothy nodded solemnly. I'm scared all the time, but Mommy says being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do the right thing even when you're scared. Kevin felt something shift in his chest as he looked at this remarkable little girl. Your mommy is very wise and very brave. Are you going to be my daddy? Dorothy asked, her blue eyes searching his face with heartbreaking hope. Kevin chose his words carefully. Dorothy, I hope very much that I am your daddy. We need to do a special test to make sure, but regardless of what that test says, I promise you that I will always be here to help take care of you and your mommy. Dorothy considered this for a moment, then reached over and took his hand in both of her small ones. I think you are my daddy. You have the same hands as me, see? She placed her tiny palm against his much larger one, and Kevin was amazed to see that she was right. They had the same long fingers, the same shape to their nails. 3 hours later, Nancy emerged from the treatment area looking exhausted but hopeful. The experimental chemotherapy would be administered over several months, with treatments 3 times per week. The doctors were cautiously optimistic about her response to the new protocol. How do you feel, Mommy? Dorothy asked, wrapping her arms around Nancy's waist. Tired but hopeful, Nancy replied honestly. Dr. Martinez thinks this new medicine might help me get better. As they prepared to leave the hospital, Kevin's phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Harrison. The DNA test could be conducted that afternoon, with results available within 48 hours. Kevin showed the message to Nancy, who nodded her agreement. The DNA test itself was simple and quick, just a cheek swab for both Kevin and Dorothy. Dorothy found the whole process fascinating, asking the lab technician dozens of questions about how they could tell if people were related just from spit. It's like a puzzle, sweetheart, the technician explained patiently. Everyone has special markers that they get from their mommy and daddy. If Mr. Kevin is your daddy, you'll have some of the same markers he has. Like a secret code? Dorothy asked excitedly. Exactly like a secret code. That evening, Kevin insisted on taking Nancy and Dorothy to dinner at a family restaurant near their apartment. As they sat in a booth sharing pizza and talking about Dorothy's school and her favorite subjects, Kevin felt a sense of rightness that he hadn't experienced in years. Tell me about your life, Dorothy, Kevin said as she carefully picked pepperoni off her pizza slice. What do you like to do for fun? I like to read, Dorothy said seriously, and I like to draw pictures, and I help Mommy with cooking and cleaning because she gets tired easily. Nancy's expression grew sad as she listened to her daughter describe the adult responsibilities she had taken on. Dorothy is my little helper, she said softly. Sometimes I think she takes care of me more than I take care of her. Mommy, that's what families do, Dorothy said matter-of-factly. They take care of each other. Kevin found himself profoundly moved by this 7-year-old's wisdom and maturity. Whatever the DNA test revealed, Dorothy was an extraordinary child who deserved every opportunity life could offer. After dinner, Kevin walked them back to their apartment, carrying a sleeping Dorothy in his arms. She had dozed off in the restaurant, exhausted by the emotional weight of the day. As he carried her up the narrow stairs, Kevin marveled at how perfectly she fit in his arms, how natural it felt to hold her. "She likes you," Nancy observed quietly, as Kevin gently placed Dorothy on her small bed, not bothering to change her clothes. "I like her too," Kevin replied, smoothing Dorothy's blonde hair away from her face. "She's remarkable, Nancy. You've done an incredible job raising her." Nancy smiled sadly. "I've done my best, but it hasn't been easy. There are so many things I wish I could give her. Music lessons, dance classes, trips to the zoo. Just normal childhood experiences that cost money I don't have." "Those things can be arranged," Kevin said softly. "All of them." As they stood in Dorothy's doorway watching her sleep, Nancy finally asked the question that had been weighing on both their minds. "Kevin, what happens if the DNA test is negative? What happens if Dorothy isn't your biological daughter?" Kevin was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. "Nancy, in the past 48 hours, that little girl has changed something fundamental inside me. Biology is just science. What matters is love, commitment, and choice. If Dorothy isn't my biological daughter, I'd like to discuss adopting her anyway." Nancy stared at him in shock. "Kevin, you can't be serious." "I've never been more serious about anything in my life," Kevin replied. "I spent 8 years convinced I could never be a father, never have a family. Now I discover I might have had both all along. I'm not going to waste any more time." The next day brought unexpected complications. Kevin arrived at his office to find Susan waiting in his conference room with a stack of legal documents and a grim expression. "Kevin, we need to talk," Susan said without preamble. "I've been doing some research into your Nancy Cromwell, and you need to see what I've found." Kevin reluctantly took the chair across from her, noting the triumphant gleam in Susan's eyes. "What kind of research?" "The kind that reveals the truth about the woman you're so eager to rescue," Susan said, sliding a folder across the table. "Nancy Cromwell has quite an interesting history. Did you know she was married 2 years ago? To a man named Robert Fitzpatrick?" Kevin's blood ran cold as he opened the folder to find copies of a marriage certificate and several photographs showing Nancy in a wedding dress, kissing a tall man with dark hair. "The marriage was annulled after 6 months," Susan continued, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Apparently, Mr. Fitzpatrick discovered that Nancy had been less than honest about several aspects of her past, including the existence of a child." Kevin stared at the documents, feeling the familiar sensation of having the ground shift beneath his feet. "When was this marriage?" 2 years ago, which means Nancy was playing house with another man while raising the child she claims is yours. Kevin, doesn't this pattern seem familiar? Doesn't it remind you of what happened 8 years ago? Before Kevin could respond, his assistant knocked on the conference room door. "Mr. Barton, Dr. Harrison is on line 1. He says it's urgent regarding the test results you've been waiting for." Kevin's heart pounded as he reached for the phone. It had only been 36 hours since the DNA test was administered, but Dr. Harrison had promised to rush the results. "Mike, what do you have for me?" "Kevin, I have the preliminary results. I wanted to call you immediately because—" Dr. Harrison paused, and Kevin could hear papers shuffling in the background. "Kevin, the test results are negative. There's no biological relationship between you and the child." The words hit Kevin like a physical blow. He felt Susan's hand on his shoulder, her voice offering comfort that sounded hollow in his ears. "Kevin, I'm so sorry. I know this must be devastating." Kevin ended the call in a daze, staring at the marriage certificate and photos spread across the conference table. Nancy had lied to him again. Just like 8 years ago, she had created an elaborate deception, this time using an innocent child as a pawn. "Kevin, I know this hurts," Susan said gently, "but now you can see the truth. Nancy Cromwell is a manipulator who preys on successful men. First you, then this Fitzpatrick fellow, now you again. She's using her dying daughter to extract money from you. Dorothy isn't dying, Kevin said quietly. Nancy is. Details. Susan waved dismissively. The point is, you've been manipulated, again. But it's not too late to extricate yourself from this situation cleanly. Kevin stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward into the wall. I need to see Nancy. I need to hear her explanation. Kevin, what explanation could possibly justify this level of deception? Susan called after him as he headed for the door. You owe her nothing. But Kevin was already gone, his mind reeling with questions and anger, and a heartbreak that felt all too familiar. As he drove toward Capitol Hill, he tried to reconcile the Nancy he had been falling in love with all over again, with the woman who could orchestrate such an elaborate lie. When he arrived at Nancy's apartment, he found her in the middle of packing boxes, her movements slow and deliberate due to the effects of her chemotherapy treatment. Kevin, she said, looking up with surprise and pleasure. I wasn't expecting you until this evening. How did the DNA results? She stopped mid-sentence when she saw his expression. We need to talk, Kevin said curtly. About Robert Fitzpatrick. About your marriage 2 years ago. About the lies you've been telling me. Nancy's face went white, and she sank into her chair as if her legs could no longer support her. Kevin, I can explain. Can you? Kevin interrupted, his voice cold with controlled anger. Can you explain why you failed to mention that you were married 2 years ago? Can you explain why that marriage was annulled when your husband discovered you had been lying to him? And can you explain why the DNA test came back negative? Nancy's eyes filled with tears, but she met his gaze steadily. The DNA test was negative. Don't act surprised, Nancy. Did you really think I wouldn't find out the truth eventually? Kevin, please let me explain everything. Yes, I was married to Robert. Yes, it ended badly. But not for the reasons you think. And the DNA test, there must be some mistake. The mistake was trusting you again, Kevin said, his heart breaking even as he spoke the words. 8 years ago, I thought you had betrayed me. I spent all this time wondering if I had been wrong, if I had thrown away the best thing in my life. Now I discover that my instincts were right all along. Kevin, please, Nancy pleaded, struggling to stand. I know how this looks, but you have to believe me. Dorothy is your daughter. I don't know why the test came back negative, but there has to be an explanation. Where is Dorothy? Kevin asked, suddenly realizing the apartment was too quiet. She's at school. Kevin, please don't leave things like this. Please let me explain about Robert, about everything. Kevin looked at Nancy, seeing past her illness to the woman who had apparently manipulated him twice. I've heard enough explanations, Nancy. I've made arrangements for your treatment to continue through the end of the month. After that, you're on your own. As Kevin turned to leave, Nancy called after him with desperation in her voice. Kevin, I love you. I've never stopped loving you. Dorothy is your daughter, no matter what any test says. Please don't abandon us again. But Kevin was already gone, leaving Nancy alone with her boxes and her fears and the growing certainty that someone was working very hard to destroy any chance of happiness she might have found. That evening, Kevin sat in his penthouse with Susan, staring out at the city lights and trying to process the day's revelations. Susan had opened a bottle of expensive wine and was doing her best to comfort him, but Kevin felt numb and empty. I should have listened to you, Kevin said finally. I should have known better than to trust her again. Kevin, you're a good man, Susan replied, settling beside him on the leather sofa. Your instinct is to help people, to see the best in them. Nancy took advantage of that kindness. Kevin's phone buzzed with a text message. Against his better judgment, he looked at it, expecting another plea from Nancy. Instead, it was from Dorothy, typed in the careful phonetic spelling of a 7-year-old. Mr. Kevin, why are you mad at Mommy? She is crying and won't tell me why. Did I do something wrong? I promise I will be better. Please don't be mad at us. Kevin stared at the message, feeling his heart shatter completely. Whatever Nancy had done, Dorothy was an innocent victim, caught in the crossfire of adult deceptions and broken trust. Who's texting you? Susan asked, noticing his expression. Dorothy. She's asking why I'm angry with her mother. Susan's expression hardened slightly. Kevin, you can't let a child's emotions manipulate you. Nancy is probably coaching her on what to say. But Kevin couldn't shake the image of Dorothy sitting in her small apartment, confused and frightened by the sudden absence of the man she had begun to think of as her father. He typed back carefully, "Dorothy, you didn't do anything wrong. You are perfect just the way you are. Sometimes grown-ups have disagreements that have nothing to do with little girls. Take care of your mommy." Dorothy's response came back immediately. "Will you still be my daddy even if you are mad at mommy?" Kevin stared at the question that cut to the heart of everything he was feeling. Whether or not Dorothy was his biological daughter, she had already claimed a place in his heart. Could he really walk away from her because of Nancy's deceptions? Before he could answer, another text arrived. "Mommy says the test was wrong. She says sometimes tests make mistakes. I think you're my daddy because you have my eyes." Kevin set his phone down and walked to the window, his reflection staring back at him from the dark glass. Behind him, Susan was watching his every move with calculating eyes. "Kevin, you can't seriously be considering continuing this relationship after everything you've learned today." "Dorothy didn't lie to me," Kevin said quietly. "Dorothy didn't deceive me or manipulate me. Dorothy is just a little girl who needs someone to care about her. Dorothy is Nancy's daughter, not yours. You have no legal obligation to her, no moral responsibility. You've already paid for Nancy's medical treatment, which is more than generous under the circumstances." Kevin turned from the window to face Susan, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time in their relationship. "Susan, when did you become so cold? When did you become someone who could dismiss a child's welfare so easily?" Susan's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something calculating and desperate underneath. "I became realistic, Kevin. I learned to protect the people I care about from being taken advantage of by manipulative people. Or maybe," Kevin said slowly, pieces of a puzzle beginning to fall into place in his mind, "maybe you became someone who manipulates situations to get what she wants." Susan's face flushed with anger. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I'm beginning to wonder about the evidence that broke Nancy and me up 8 years ago. It means I'm wondering about the convenient timing of your research into Nancy's marriage. And it means I'm wondering about DNA test results that came back faster than they should have." "Kevin, you're being paranoid. The stress of this situation is affecting your judgment." But Kevin was already reaching for his phone, scrolling through his contacts. "Mike Harrison is not just my doctor, he's my friend. He's also one of the most ethical people I know. I think I'll give him a call and ask some very specific questions about how that DNA test was processed." Susan's face went pale. "Kevin, you're overreacting. Why would anyone want to tamper with a DNA test?" "That's an excellent question," Kevin replied, his finger hovering over Dr. Harrison's number. "I'm sure Mike will have some interesting insights." As Kevin placed the call, Susan quietly gathered her purse and coat, moving toward the door with the stealth of someone who didn't want to be part of the conversation that was about to take place. "Mike, it's Kevin again. I need to ask you some very specific questions about the DNA test you processed for me. Questions about chain of custody, about who had access to the samples, and about whether it's possible for results to be tampered with." Dr. Harrison's voice was puzzled but concerned. "Kevin, those are odd questions. Is there some reason you suspect the results might not be accurate?" "Let's just say I'm beginning to question whether everyone involved in this process had honest intentions. Kevin, I have to tell you there was something unusual about your test. Susan Osborne called my office yesterday morning claiming to be calling on your behalf. She wanted to know about the processing timeline and the security protocols we use. My staff told her those details were confidential, but..." Kevin's blood ran cold. "But what, Mike?" "But later that day there was a brief power outage in our lab. Nothing serious, just a few minutes. When power was restored, we discovered that one of our lab technicians had to rerun several tests because of computer glitches caused by the outage, including yours. Mike, I need you to rerun that test immediately. New samples, different lab, maximum security protocols, and I need the original samples tested by an independent laboratory. Kevin, that's going to take several days and cost significantly more. I don't care about the cost. I care about the truth." After ending the call, Kevin looked around his empty penthouse, realizing that Susan had slipped away during his conversation with Dr. Harrison. For the first time in their 2-year relationship, he was grateful for her absence. He picked up his phone and scrolled to Dorothy's number, typing carefully. "Dorothy, I'm sorry for worrying you. There was a mistake with the test, and we need to do it again. I hope that's okay with you." Her response came back within minutes. "Yes, it's okay. Mommy says mistakes happen all the time. She says the important thing is fixing them. Are you coming to see us tomorrow?" Kevin smiled for the first time in 24 hours. "Yes, I'll see you tomorrow. Tell your mommy I'd like to talk to her about something very important." "Yay, Mommy will be so happy. She miss you a lot." As Kevin prepared for bed that night, he felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. If his suspicions about Susan were correct, then Nancy might be innocent of the deceptions he had accused her of. But that would also mean that the woman he had been involved with for 2 years was capable of manipulating DNA test results to destroy his chance at happiness. The next morning, Kevin arrived at Nancy's apartment to find her in the middle of unpacking the boxes she had been packing the day before. She looked up when he knocked, her expression wary but hopeful. "Kevin," she said softly, opening the door wider to let him in. "I wasn't sure I'd see you again. Nancy, I owe you an apology and an explanation." Kevin settled on her small sofa, noting that Dorothy was at school and they could speak freely. "I have reason to believe that the DNA test results were tampered with." Nancy stared at him in shock. "Tampered with? By whom?" "Susan Osborne. My girlfriend. My ex-girlfriend," Kevin corrected himself. "Nancy, I need you to tell me about Robert Fitzpatrick. I need to understand what really happened with your marriage." Nancy took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for a difficult conversation. "Robert was a mistake. A rebound relationship that I entered into when Dorothy was 5. He seemed kind and stable, and I thought Dorothy needed a father figure in her life. Why was the marriage annulled? Because I lied to him," Nancy admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not about Dorothy's paternity. I never told him who Dorothy's father was. I lied about my feelings. I married him hoping I could learn to love him, but I couldn't. I was still in love with you, Kevin. I never stopped being in love with you." Kevin felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. "Why didn't you tell me about the marriage yesterday?" "Because I was ashamed. Because I knew how it would look. Because I was afraid you'd think I was the kind of person who uses men, when the truth is that Robert was the only other relationship I've had since you. And it failed precisely because I couldn't get over you." Kevin reached across the small space between them and took Nancy's hand in his. "Nancy, 8 years ago someone convinced me that you were cheating on me. They had photos, witnesses, evidence that seemed overwhelming. I never questioned it because I was young and insecure and afraid that someone like you could never really love someone like me. Kevin, I never cheated on you. I never even looked at another man the entire time we were together. You were everything to me. I'm beginning to think we were both victims of someone else's manipulation," Kevin said quietly. "Someone who wanted to keep us apart 8 years ago, and who is trying to do it again now." Before Nancy could respond, Kevin's phone rang. Dr. Harrison's name appeared on the screen, and Kevin answered immediately. "Mike, please tell me you have news." "Kevin, I have very disturbing news. The original DNA samples were definitely tampered with. Someone introduced a foreign substance that would cause a false negative result. But we ran the new test you requested, and Kevin, you need to sit down." "I'm sitting. What are the results?" "Kevin, Dorothy is definitely your daughter. There's no question whatsoever. The paternity probability is 99.97%. Kevin felt the world shift back into focus, colors becoming brighter and sounds becoming clearer. He looked at Nancy, who was watching his face with desperate hope. "She's mine," he said softly. "Dorothy is my daughter." Nancy burst into tears, covering her face with her hands as relief flooded through her. "I knew it," she sobbed. "I knew the test was wrong. Kevin, I would never lie to you about something so important." Kevin ended the call and pulled Nancy into his arms. holding her as she cried against his chest. "Nancy, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for doubting you, for believing the worst, for walking away. I'm sorry for 8 years of missed bedtime stories and birthday parties and first days of school." "You're here now," Nancy whispered against his shirt. "That's what matters. You're here now." They held each other in the small apartment, two people who had lost 8 years of their lives to lies and manipulation, finally finding their way back to each other. When Nancy finally pulled back to look at his face, Kevin gently wiped the tears from her cheeks. "Nancy, there's something else we need to discuss. I think Susan was involved in what happened 8 years ago, too. I think she's been manipulating both of us for a very long time." Nancy's eyes widened with understanding. "Susan Osborne. I remember her from when we were dating. She worked at your company then too, didn't she?" "She did. And she was always around, always offering to help with problems, always ready with information that seemed to prove your betrayal." Kevin felt anger building in his chest as he began to see the pattern that had been hidden for so long. "Kevin, what are we going to do?" Before Kevin could answer, the apartment door burst open and Dorothy ran in, still wearing her school backpack and chattering excitedly about her day. She stopped short when she saw Kevin and Nancy sitting together on the sofa, their faces serious. "Are you guys sad?" Dorothy asked, her young face creased with concern. "No, sweetheart," Kevin said, opening his arms to her. "We're happy. Very, very happy. Dorothy, I have something important to tell you." Dorothy climbed onto the sofa between them, looking back and forth between the two adults who had become the center of her world. "Dorothy," Kevin said carefully, "the test results came back, and they show that I am definitely your daddy." Dorothy's face lit up with pure joy. "I knew it," she exclaimed, throwing her arms around Kevin's neck. "I knew you were my daddy because you have my eyes and my hands and you're nice to mommy." Kevin held his daughter for the first time as her father, breathing in the scent of her hair and feeling a completeness he had never experienced before. Over Dorothy's head, he met Nancy's eyes and saw his own feelings reflected there: love, relief, and determination to protect their family from anyone who might try to tear them apart again. "Daddy," Dorothy said, pulling back to look at his face, "does this mean you're going to live with us now?" Kevin looked at Nancy, seeing the question in her eyes as well. "Dorothy, would you like that?" "More than anything in the whole world," Dorothy said seriously. "Then you could read me bedtime stories and help me with my homework and teach me how to drive your fancy car when I'm big enough." Kevin laughed, the sound rich and full of joy. "I think I'd like that very much too." But even as Kevin basked in the happiness of finally being united with his family, he knew that Susan wasn't going to give up easily. She had invested too much time and effort in keeping them apart to simply accept defeat. The battle for their family was just beginning. That evening, Kevin returned to his penthouse to find Susan waiting for him once again, but this time she wasn't alone. A tall man in an expensive suit stood beside her, and Kevin recognized him immediately from the photographs Susan had shown him: Robert Fitzpatrick. "Kevin," Susan said with false brightness, "I'd like you to meet Robert Fitzpatrick, Nancy's ex-husband. He has some very interesting things to tell you about the woman you're so eager to trust." Robert stepped forward with an apologetic smile. "Mr. Barton, I'm sorry to intrude, but when Susan told me about your situation with Nancy, I felt I had to warn you. Nancy Cromwell is not the woman she pretends to be." Kevin studied both of them, noting how Susan's hand rested possessively on Robert's arm, how their body language suggested a partnership that went beyond simple acquaintance. "Really?" Kevin said mildly. "How long have you two known each other?" Susan and Robert exchanged a quick glance that they thought Kevin didn't notice. "We just met recently," Susan said smoothly, "through mutual friends. When Robert heard about your situation, he volunteered to share his experience." "How generous of him," Kevin replied. "And what exactly is your experience with Nancy, Mr. Fitzpatrick?" Robert launched into a rehearsed-sounding speech about Nancy's supposed deceptions during their marriage, her alleged manipulation of men for financial gain, and her claims that Dorothy's father was a wealthy businessman who had abandoned them. As Robert spoke, Kevin watched Susan's face, noting the satisfaction in her expression as she listened to Nancy being systematically destroyed by a man who was supposed to have loved her. "That's quite a story," Kevin said when Robert finished. "There's just one problem with it." "What's that?" Susan asked, her confidence wavering slightly. "Nancy and I had new DNA tests done today, with maximum security protocols and independent verification. Dorothy is definitely my daughter, which means every word of what you both just told me is a lie." The color drained from Susan's face, while Robert looked confused and slightly panicked. "Kevin, that's impossible. The first test was tampered with," Kevin interrupted, "by someone with access to my doctor's office and knowledge of the testing procedures. Someone who called pretending to be acting on my behalf." Susan's composure finally cracked completely. "Kevin, you're making a mistake. Nancy is using you just like she used Robert. Can't you see that?" "What I see," Kevin said calmly, "is a woman who has spent 8 years raising my daughter alone because someone convinced me that the woman I loved had betrayed me. What I see is a pattern of manipulation and lies designed to keep me from my family." Kevin pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. "Susan, I think it's time we had a conversation with my security team, and my lawyers, and possibly the police, depending on how cooperative you decide to be about explaining exactly how you managed to tamper with medical test results." Robert backed toward the door, clearly realizing he had been used as a pawn in Susan's scheme. "Look, I don't know what's going on here, but I was just trying to help. Susan said you were being taken advantage of by the same woman who had hurt me." "Mr. Fitzpatrick," Kevin said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "I suggest you leave now, before you become any more involved in whatever Susan has been planning." After Robert fled, Kevin turned his full attention to Susan, who was standing in his living room like a cornered animal. 8 years, Susan. For 8 years you've been manipulating my life, keeping me from my family, building a relationship based on lies. Why?" Susan's mask finally fell away completely, revealing the obsessive, calculating woman beneath. "Because I love you," she screamed, her composure shattering. "Because Nancy Peterson was never good enough for you. Because you deserved someone who understood your ambitions, who could match your success." "What you loved was an idea of me," Kevin replied coldly. "You loved my money, my status, my company. You never loved me, because you never bothered to learn who I really am." "I know exactly who you are," Susan spat. "You're a man who throws away everything he's worked for because of some fantasy about a perfect family. You're a fool who can be manipulated by a dying woman and a child who isn't even—" "Susan," Kevin interrupted, his voice dangerously quiet, "Dorothy is my daughter. And tomorrow morning I'm going to call the police and report that medical test results were tampered with in what appears to be a deliberate attempt to defraud me and harm my family." Susan stared at him for a long moment, seeming to realize that her years of careful manipulation had finally collapsed around her. "Kevin, please, we can work this out. I made mistakes, but I did it all for love. For us." "There is no us," Kevin said firmly. "There never really was. You're fired, Susan. Clear out your office tonight. Security will escort you from the building." As Susan gathered her belongings and left his penthouse for the last time, Kevin felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. For the first time in 8 years, his life was completely his own, free from manipulation and lies. He picked up his phone and called Nancy, his heart racing with anticipation. "Kevin?" Nancy answered on the first ring, her voice hopeful and anxious. "Nancy, it's over. Susan is gone and I know the truth about everything. About 8 years ago. About the DNA test, about all of it." Nancy's sob of relief was audible through the phone. "Kevin, does this mean—" "It means I love you," Kevin said, the words flowing from his heart without reservation. "It means I want to be Dorothy's father and your husband and part of a family I should have had all along." "Kevin," Nancy whispered, "I love you too. I never stopped loving you." "I'm coming over," Kevin said, already reaching for his car keys. "I want to read Dorothy a bedtime story tonight." as her father. When Kevin arrived at the apartment, he found Nancy and Dorothy cuddled together on the sofa, reading a picture book about a little girl who goes on adventures with her father. Dorothy looked up when he entered, her face lighting up with pure joy. "Daddy," she exclaimed, launching herself into his arms. "Mommy said you're going to stay with us now." "If that's what you want," Kevin said, settling onto the sofa with Dorothy in his lap and Nancy curled against his side. "It's what I've wanted my whole life," Dorothy said seriously. "Even before I knew who you were, I used to wish for a daddy who would love me and Mommy." Kevin looked around the small apartment that had become more of a home to him in a few days than his penthouse had been in years. "Actually, I was thinking that maybe you and Mommy might like to come live with me. I have a very big house with lots of rooms and a yard where you could play." Dorothy's eyes widened with excitement. "Really? Could we bring all my stuffed animals?" "We can bring everything that's important to you," Kevin promised. As they sat together planning their future, Kevin's phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Harrison. "Kevin wanted you to know that the authorities are very interested in the test tampering case. Susan Osborne is going to have some serious legal problems. Also, Nancy's treatment is showing early signs of success. The new protocol seems to be working." Kevin showed the message to Nancy, who burst into tears of relief and joy. "Kevin, maybe everything is going to be okay after all." "Everything is going to be better than okay," Kevin replied, kissing her forehead gently. "We're going to be a family, a real family." 3 months later, Kevin, Nancy, and Dorothy were living together in Kevin's renovated penthouse, which had been transformed from a cold bachelor pad into a warm family home. Dorothy's artwork covered the refrigerator, children's books filled the bookshelves, and the sound of laughter echoed through rooms that had been silent for too long. Nancy's treatment was progressing better than anyone had dared hope. Her hair was beginning to grow back and her energy levels were slowly returning to normal. Most importantly, the latest scans showed that the experimental treatment was working. The cancer was in full remission. On a crisp December evening, just 2 weeks before Dorothy's 8th birthday, Kevin found himself pacing nervously in their bedroom while Nancy helped Dorothy with her homework at the kitchen table. Hidden in his nightstand drawer was a small velvet box that had been burning a hole in his consciousness for weeks. "Daddy, you're walking funny," Dorothy observed when he emerged from the bedroom for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. "Are your feet okay?" Nancy looked up from Dorothy's math worksheet, noting Kevin's obvious nervousness with amusement. "Yes, Daddy, are your feet okay?" Kevin took a deep breath, realizing that his elaborate plans for a romantic proposal seemed silly in the face of the simple, genuine love that filled their home every day. "Actually, my feet are fine, but my heart is very full." Dorothy tilted her head with curiosity. "What does that mean?" Kevin knelt down beside Dorothy's chair, pulling the small velvet box from his pocket. "It means that I love you and your Mommy more than I ever thought it was possible to love anyone. And I was wondering if you would help me ask your Mommy a very important question." Dorothy's eyes widened with excitement as she saw the ring box. "Is that what I think it is?" "That depends on what you think it is," Kevin said, grinning at his daughter's enthusiasm. "It's a ring for Mommy. You're going to ask her to marry you." Dorothy practically bounced in her chair with excitement. Nancy covered her mouth with her hands, tears already forming in her eyes as she watched the 2 most important people in her world share this moment. "Dorothy," Kevin said seriously, "I need to ask you something first. Would it be okay with you if I married your Mommy? Would you want me to be your daddy forever and always, legally and officially?" Dorothy launched herself into Kevin's arms, nearly knocking him over with the force of her enthusiasm. "Yes, yes, yes, I want you to be my daddy forever. And I want you to marry Mommy so we can all have the same last name." Kevin stood up, still holding Dorothy, and turned to face Nancy, who was watching them through tears of joy. "Nancy Cromwell," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. 8 years ago, I thought I lost you forever. 3 months ago, I discovered that the best parts of my life were waiting for me to be brave enough to claim them." He set Dorothy down and took Nancy's hands in his, the ring box balanced carefully in his palm. "Nancy, you are the strongest, most beautiful, Most incredible woman I have ever known. You raised our daughter to be brilliant and kind and fearless. You fought for your life so you could be there for her. You forgave me for doubting you and welcomed me into the family you had built with such love and determination." Nancy was crying openly now, but her smile was radiant. "Kevin, Nancy, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life making up for the years we lost? Will you let me be the husband you deserve and the father Dorothy needs?" "Yes," Nancy whispered, then louder. "Yes, of course, yes." Kevin slipped the ring onto Nancy's finger, a stunning solitaire diamond surrounded by smaller stones that caught the light from every angle. Dorothy clapped her hands with delight, dancing around the kitchen table in celebration. "We're going to be a real family," Dorothy sang. "We're going to be the Bartons." As Kevin kissed Nancy, sealing their engagement and their commitment to the future they would build together, Dorothy continued her celebratory dance, already making plans for the wedding, for the family they would become, for all the adventures that lay ahead. 6 months later, on a perfect June day overlooking Elliott Bay, Kevin and Nancy were married in a small ceremony attended by close friends and family. Dorothy served as the flower girl, wearing a dress the exact shade of blue as her eyes and carrying a bouquet of white roses. She had insisted on being part of the ceremony in every way possible, even writing her own vows to both her parents about how happy she was to finally have a complete family. Dr. Harrison, who had become not just Kevin's physician but a close family friend, officiated the ceremony. In his remarks, he spoke about the power of truth to heal old wounds and the importance of never giving up on love, even when it seems lost forever. Susan Osborne was notably absent, serving a prison sentence for fraud and conspiracy charges related to the tampering of medical records. Her elaborate scheme to destroy Kevin and Nancy's relationship had ultimately been her downfall, exposing a pattern of manipulation and criminal behavior that extended far beyond their situation. As Kevin and Nancy exchanged vows, promising to love and protect each other through whatever challenges life might bring, Dorothy stood beside them with tears of happiness streaming down her young face. This little girl, who had been brave enough to deliver a letter that changed everything, had finally gotten the family she had always dreamed of. In his vows, Kevin spoke directly to Dorothy as well as to Nancy. "Dorothy, you came into my life carrying a letter from your mother, but you brought me so much more than that. You brought me purpose, joy, and the chance to be the father I always hoped I could be. I promise you that I will never let anything or anyone separate our family again." Nancy's vows were equally emotional. "Kevin, 8 years ago, we lost each other to lies and misunderstandings, but our love created something beautiful, our daughter Dorothy, who brought us back together. I promise to trust in our love, to communicate openly and honestly, and to build the future we should have had all along." After the ceremony, as the small wedding party celebrated with dinner and dancing on the terrace of Kevin's penthouse, Dorothy pulled both her parents aside for a private moment. "Mommy, Daddy," she said seriously, "I have something important to tell you." Kevin and Nancy exchanged amused glances, wondering what profound observation their 8-year-old daughter was about to share. "What is it, sweetheart?" Nancy asked. Dorothy took both their hands in her small ones, her expression solemn. "I'm glad I was brave enough to take that letter to Daddy's office. I was really scared that day, but Mommy always says that being brave means doing the right thing even when you're scared." Kevin knelt down to Dorothy's level, his heart full of pride and love for this remarkable child. "Dorothy, you are the bravest person I know. If you hadn't delivered that letter, we might never have found each other again." "The letter was important," Dorothy agreed, "but I think love was more important. Love made you come see us. Love made you help Mommy get better. Love made us into a family." Nancy wiped tears from her eyes as she listened to her daughter's wisdom. "You're absolutely right, sweetheart. Love was the most important thing of all." As the sun set over Seattle, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, the Barton family stood together on their terrace, looking out over the city where their story had unfolded. Dorothy was right. It had been love that brought them together, love that sustained them through the challenges, and love that would carry them into whatever future awaited them. Kevin wrapped his arms around his wife and daughter, marveling at how completely his life had changed from that morning when a small blonde girl had walked into his office with a wrinkled envelope and an unshakable determination to reunite her family. "What are you thinking about, Daddy?" Dorothy asked, noticing his contemplative expression. "I'm thinking about how sometimes the most important things come in the smallest packages," Kevin replied, squeezing her gently. "And I'm thinking about how grateful I am that you were brave enough to deliver your mother's letter." Dorothy smiled up at him with the wisdom of a child who had seen her wishes come true through courage and persistence. "Mommy always says that good things happen to people who don't give up. We didn't give up on being a family, did we?" "No, sweetheart," Nancy said, joining their embrace as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. "We never gave up, and now we have forever to be together." As they stood there, surrounded by the glow of the city lights and wrapped in the warmth of their love for each other, Kevin reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A letter written by a dying woman to the man she had never stopped loving. A 7-year-old girl brave enough to cross a city to deliver that letter. A love strong enough to survive 8 years of separation, manipulation, and lies. Their story had begun with a simple question. Can you read this letter? It's very important. But it had become something far more significant, a testament to the power of family, the strength of true love, and the courage required to fight for the people who matter most. The letter that had changed everything was now framed and hanging in Dorothy's bedroom, a reminder of the day a little girl's bravery had brought her family home. But more than that, it was a symbol of hope, proof that sometimes, against all odds, love really does conquer all. As the Barton family headed inside to continue their celebration, Dorothy skipped ahead of her parents, her voice carrying back to them on the evening breeze. "Tomorrow I'm going to write letters too. Letters to my friends telling them about my wedding and my new daddy and how dreams really do come true if you're brave enough to make them happen." Kevin and Nancy exchanged a look of pure happiness, knowing that their daughter, their brave, wise, wonderful daughter, would indeed make her dreams come true, just as she had made theirs come true with one very important letter on one very ordinary Tuesday morning that had turned out to be the most extraordinary day of their lives. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this beautiful love story. Let us know what you thought of this tale full of emotions and surprises. Tell us your name, where you're watching from, and rate this story from 0 to 10 if it touched your heart. And if you enjoyed the plot, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the amazing new stories coming soon. See you next time.